Observing the communion during coronavirus is dangerous. I don't know what people are thinking about. Using one cup in communion is even more dangerous. That is crazy talk. If you do observe the communion, then it would be better to use alcoholic wine because the alcohol can kill the germs. Everybody knows that, of course. If you're going to use one cup, using a silver cup, at least a plated silver cup, would be better because silver has an antibacterial effect. Listen guys, it's impossible to get sick from taking the communion. Hey everybody watching, welcome to the review of 5-Minute Bible Study on what is sanitation in communion. Everything that I just said before, I was just representing common opinions about the communion, known as the Lord's Supper in some contexts, also known among some churches as the Eucharist. I'm trying to make this video appealing to all general audiences, so I'll try to give background to everything spoken so that everybody can understand. But basically, we are in the year of the coronavirus, and a lot of churches are not even assembling at all still. Some are just simply having maybe one worship service a week or a month. Definitely a lot of churches are not observing what is known as the communion service, the observance remembering the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus using emblems. This is something that has come to a head now in this big concern of sanitation, germs spreading, virus transmission, and all that, but it's not really anything new. And so just this year, I took it upon myself to reprint and recirculate a book called Sanitation in Communion. And as you can see, it's not a big book, about 40-something odd pages. It's written by Dr. James D. Orton, a preacher in the Churches of Christ, and Brother Alton Bailey, who originally published the first edition in 1983. Alton Bailey and James Orton republished a second edition that was quite different than the first edition in 1993. That's actually the year I was born, so to age everybody here. And then I just reprinted in this 2020, this third edition, which is the second edition, just given new formatting and made easier to read and all that. But the big deal is that there is a concern, and has been a concern for over 100 years, about observing the communion supper just like Jesus and the apostles observed it in the upper room in that first century account of the Gospels. And so here we want to talk about some things surrounding that, some background issues, but then come to a head on these opinions that we just stated. Some very strong-held opinions, long-held opinions that in this book, Sanitation in Communion, those are either debunked or affirmed. And I'm not going to give it away, but that is what we're going to be doing eventually. So if you really wanted to, you could skip ahead and go to those examinations of those opinions and assumptions. But let me just give you a little background of sanitation in communion for just a minute. For the first few hundred years of the church, after Jesus established it like he said he would in Matthew 16, the churches known as the disciples, they would assemble every first day of the week. That became known as the Lord's Day. That's what John the Apostle calls it in John chapter 1. And that became called the Lord's Day because it was the practice of the early church to every first day of the week, just as you see in Acts 20 and verse 7, on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. That to break bread became a euphemism for the communion supper, where the people would do exactly like Jesus did. They would take a cup and they would drink from it, representing the new covenant and the blood Jesus shed on the cross. And then they would take a loaf of bread and they would break off a piece, pass it around, and everybody would take of that. That was known as communion, which is literally joint participation. So all these people, the disciples of Christ, would jointly participate in remembering through this institution what Jesus did to forgive our sins and bring in the new covenant. So that's what's been going on for so many years. Eventually, the Catholic Church, what would become the Catholic Church, started using 2 cups, 1 cup for each aisle of a congregation or assembly of people. And that went on for some time. So either churches were using 1 cup and 1 loaf, or 2 cups and 2 loaves perhaps. And that went on for centuries. And then eventually in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a big explosion, investigations of germs, and that became very public knowledge to everyone. So everybody was really concerned about observing this service traditionally as it had been done for over 1800 years. And different divisions were created. The first churches to implement individual communion sets were the Presbyterians. Dr. J.G. Thomas was a Presbyterian minister who implemented that for the first time. In 1915, that was when the Churches of Christ implemented individual communion cups. If you don't have much of a background knowledge of the Churches of Christ, going back before 1915, if you were to see the Church of Christ sign on the road, there's a lot around here in Tennessee, there's a lot in Texas, a lot in Kentucky and other places. But anyways, if you were to see that sign, they would all be pretty much practicing the same thing, teaching the same thing. But up to that point in time, that's when this germ issue, it evolved into even the Churches of Christ. And so from that point on, it wasn't just one cup and one loaf that was used, but there would be Churches of Christ who used one cup and one loaf, known as the one cuppers. And there would be those that used multiple cups and multiple loaves, and they would become known as the Cups Churches of Christ. That was kind of their not informal name designated by each fellowship. And now, in today, you have still one cup Churches of Christ and Cups Churches of Christ. There are also some other issues that they disagree on, but that's really what we want to focus on right now. Because in this current pandemic, not only are the denominations around not even taking communion at all, a lot of them, but now the practice is if they do take it at all, a lot of both of these groups are not observing communion at all. Anyways, there's the new innovation of getting your Amazon individual communion set and taking it in the privacy of your home, in the sanitation of your home. Let's talk about some of the assumptions about what has led churches to totally abandoning this communion meal. Is it really backed by evidence that this is unsanitary and we should just abandon it? And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about Scripture and how that has a bearing on this practice or lack thereof. Let's set this up front. The reason that individual communion cups were innovated into the Churches of Christ and denominations, it was not because that's what the New Testament pattern gives us. It's not because that's what the disciples did in the upper room or continue to do after Jesus ascended into heaven. It was because of germs. Let's just be clear and upfront about that. And the reason that it continues is because of germs and now what is a embedded tradition. Churches that use individual cups look at churches that use one cup, especially right now during the year of the coronavirus, and say, unclean, unclean, that's so gross. I can't believe you would do that. It's so unsafe. You're a dangerous risk to not only your church, but the whole environment around you. Churches that use one cup, on the other side, look at those that have used individual cups and say, this is the pattern that God gave us. If there is any risk, this is still the pattern, and God did not give us an opt-out because there is any risk. Some of them might even look over there and say, you can't get sick because God will protect us if we keep His commandments and we observe this. Now, I'm not saying that yet what I believe about either one of these. I'm going to leave you in the dark a little bit, so you could technically skip forward and see what I believe on this issue. But both sides here say some things very boldly that in this book, Sanitation in Communion, they are addressed whether these things are backed by evidence or whether they're not. In this book, there are in the last half of the book, there are 5 research studies on either the communion service itself and is that sanitary, or research studies on the juice that's used in the communion service and the cup used in the communion service to try to get down to the gritty facts of certain things implemented for sanitation concerns. One of those being a silver-plated cup has been often used in the Churches of Christ and other denominations to help reduce bacteria on the rim of the cup. Other things have been tested as to whether alcohol and fermented wine helps reduce bacteria on the cup and other things. But we'll get to those assumptions or those opinions in just a minute and see what their research bore out. The research was not done by Dr. James Orton and Alton Bailey. They simply reviewed research that had been done over the last century and some pretty big studies. So what I would encourage you to do is to get a copy of this book. You can get a copy of that on our website. Even on this page, you can go down below and comment and say you would like a copy of it. You can go to tncgchurchofchrist.org, and on there is a book tab on the menu bar. You can go download a free PDF version of it. Or there is an ebook version on Amazon that you can buy for 99 cents, and it's an actual Kindle ebook. read the book itself. There's a lot of good information on these research studies that I don't have time and space to share with you. And so read the book. It's only about 40-something odd pages. It won't take that long, and it'll be definitely worth your time, especially if you have real concerns about this issue. But now let's get to some of these opinions, these assumptions, and let's start debunking some myths and destroying some assumptions. Let's go. Let's start with some of the arguments from this side of the aisle, and that is those that use multiple cups or those that, at this point, aren't even observing communion. They would look at those that use one cup in communion. They would say, that is extremely dangerous. You're crazy. And they might even go to say that that's not even what was practiced in the upper room. But nonetheless, just commonly held belief among most general audiences that using one cup in communion is gross. Drinking after somebody. Now, we'll say this. A buddy of mine that was recently baptized and goes to church with me now, he was talking about how before he became a Christian, it's kind of funny that he thought that using one cup in communion was gross because he would go to parties and he would drink on the weekends, and everybody would be passing around a bottle of whiskey or a bottle of some type of alcohol and be drinking out of the same bottle. And when you consider who was drinking out of it, they were all pretty intoxicated, so they probably were leaving a bit of slobber on there. They weren't really concerned about sanitation at that point. And that didn't gross them out. And so when he put that in perspective, he said, it really didn't make it that difficult for me to use one cup from that point forward. So I thought that was a pretty good story, a pretty good reference point. If people were consistent with how they operate and live their lives outside in the real world, and then how they thought about the communion service, that I think in many other parts of the worship service, I don't think that they would really be able to maintain consistency there. With that being said, people will go out and they'll go to the grocery store. And I've thought about this a lot. When you go to a restaurant and you reach underneath the chair to pull it up and to get closer to your table, do you know they don't clean the bottom underneath of those chairs? I thought about that recently. And so you're putting your hand down there to touch where everybody's hand is. People that haven't washed their hands, people that put their hands in their pants and then go down and reach down to pull their chair up. Okay, let's talk about gross. And then they go reach up, put their hand on their fries, and bring it to their mouth. That's basically taking all sorts of germs and putting it directly into your mucous membranes. Now, you go to the grocery store and you're touching any and everything, all these things, talking about germ transmission, and then you're worried about drinking after the same cup from somebody in a communion service. Now, I want you to stop. I want you to ask yourself, is that being consistent? Maybe you're the person that drinks out of the same bottle with other drinkers on the weekend parties or whatever. Let's just be consistent here. But besides that, let's get to the research that was conducted in Sanitation in Communion. The first study that they looked at was really interesting. The Anglican Church, which has traditionally used, I'm not sure if they use one cup or two cups, but they traditionally use, I believe, one cup in their worship service and still do today. There are a few other churches. I think the Orthodox Church is the same way. And the Catholic Church, I think they may use two cups predominantly speaking, but I'm not an authority on these other denominations. Anyways, the Anglican Church in the mid to early 1900s had a complaint against them, and so the British government and the Medical Research Council, they issued a study to try to determine the sanitation of the communion as observed in the Anglican Church with one cup and one loaf. Some of the things they found out was really addressing is this extremely dangerous. And there were different methods to the research. They tried to have a standard cup that was not used, and they would keep it in isolation and compare the bacteria or lack thereof on its rim to a cup that was used in a communion service. Then later, I think it was a different study that is reviewed in this, where I think it was the University of Chicago, where they not only did it with the same methods, but then they went on a step further, and instead of just a regular people taking the cup and drinking out of it, they would ask the participants to be extremely sloppy, like leave drool on the edge of the cup, and just see how much more bacteria was found on the rim of the cup when they were done with the study. There were other methods involved and other research done, so again, read the book. But this is something that they found. They found that upon further review, it really didn't show more bacteria on the rim of the used cup than the rim of the standard test cup. In some cases, this cup had more bacteria on it after it had sat out in the open air than the cup that was used during communion. What the researchers and scientists found after performing all the experiments, comparing data, and then drawing their conclusions is this. This is one of the quotes from the Medical Research Council. The risk of disease transmission in common cup communion. When I say common cup communion, I mean one cup, a common cup being used by all the communion participants. Again, the risk of disease transmission in common cup communion is very small and probably much smaller than contracting an infection by other methods in any gathering of people. So that could be referring to handshakes, talking to each other, giving each other hugs, whatever the case may be. Another quote from the University of Chicago, another very prominent study on this issue, came to their conclusion and said, "It is more dangerous to live to age 35 than to drink from the communion cup, the common communion cup." And so the findings showed that it is an assumption that it is extremely dangerous to drink out of one common communion cup. Now, did it show that you cannot get sick from it? We haven't looked at that yet. And did it say that you couldn't spread any germs? That's not what they said. They just said the chances are very, very low. And so basically, whenever this side of the line accuses this side of the line of doing something very dangerous, a high health risk, and just simply ignorant, then maybe we should reconsider that this is an assumption because of just the idea of drinking after somebody. And that's what several of these well-conducted studies came to the conclusions of. People that weren't even members of any church, people that were actually investigating the Anglican Church because they were issued by the government and had an objective opinion in the whole fight. The second assumption that we want to debunk and examine is the idea that alcohol in alcoholic wine is safer than just simple grape juice, because alcohol, as everybody knows, is a germ-killing agent. It's a bacteriostatic agent. And so why would you not use alcoholic wine in the communion supper observance? Now, we're not looking at this from a scriptural point of view. If you look in the Passover regulations, going back to Exodus 12, and the fact that the Passover was being observed when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper in the upper room, that would not have been allowed in the house in the upper room. And so we know that Jesus and the disciples didn't use that. So by following their example, we wouldn't use alcoholic wine. But then will we do it because it is of a greater health benefit, a lower risk in contracting bacteria? That's what another part of the research done in several of these experiments was looking at. And one group of researchers said, just drew the conclusion that there is a bacteriostatic effect in fermented wine, and so they just assumed that it would be due to the alcoholic content of that wine. And so they tested to prove that, and they found that out. But what they didn't do is they didn't compare that with just simple grape juice. And what they later found out is that it was not the alcohol in the wine that produced this germ-killing effect, but it was in fact the fruit, the grape itself, the natural properties of that substance that had the cleansing effect. All in all, what they would say is that having grape juice, yes, grape juice has some method, or not method, but some degree of germ-killing effect, but the time between communion participants would not be enough time for it to really kill germs put on the rim of the cup or inside the cup from one person to the next. And so while it does have some effect, there's not enough time between communion participants, so it's kind of a negligible point. And so at the end of the day, no, fermented alcoholic wine is not of a benefit. Using simple grape juice is actually of as much or more benefit than using alcohol. So if you're going to use it, then you might use it for another reason. Of course, I believe that it is unscriptural to use that, but that's another issue. Number 3, a silver-plated cup will help reduce germs on the rim of the cup and make the communion observance safer. This is an assumption that is used by people on this side of the aisle, the one cup communion position, to justify the sanitation of their communion service because we have a silver cup. Now, here's something wrong with this as a general rule. A lot of churches, especially if you go overseas to Africa and Cambodia and these other third world countries or continents, they can't afford a silver-plated cup in many places. So the majority of churches around the world are not going to be able to use a silver-plated cup. So not everybody can use that argument. Besides that, There is a cleansing agent in silver. In fact, when I do wound care as a nurse in the hospital, or I used to as an inpatient nurse, there is a Silvaderm. Silvaderm, I think was the name of it. And we would use it to layer on our wound care on wounds to help reduce bacteria and prevent infection. So yes, it's been known well within medical treatments that silver does have this effect. What these researchers looked into is it really of a health benefit during a communion service? And just like the fruit of the wine and how there's not enough time between each person taking of this cup for that grape juice to have really much of any effect at all of significance, the same was found to be true of the silver of a silver-plated cup. While it does have some effect, it takes over a couple of hours for it to be able to kill germs sitting static on the rim of a cup. And so the amount of time, which is seconds, between one participant in a communion service and the next is not enough. It's considered negligible to have any real effect at all. And so people in Africa, people in Cambodia, people in Bangladesh, all over the world, using just simply a plastic cup or whatever other cup, their communion service is really just as safe as us in the United States or Britain or wherever using a silver plated cup. It's shinier, it's nicer, it might make you feel safer, but it's really not doing anything of any import to increasing sanitation in communion. We have one more left. The fourth and final assumption we're going to look at is when this side of the aisle says it's impossible to get sick from taking common cup communion. And they might look at and have read Sanitation in Communion and drawn this conclusion and say, listen, Dr. James D. Orton and Alton Bailey did a lot of review of research, and these research methods and so forth bore out that you cannot get sick from the communion cup. It's impossible. And so this side of the aisle is listening to that, and it just doesn't even sound realistic. And they're like, you guys, no, man, this is not real. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard this, I was like, and the same way that I kind of responded to whenever I heard somebody say that the silver protects us from any germs. I was like, that just doesn't sound right. When I read the evidence, it's, confirmed what I already was thinking. So is it truly impossible to get sick from the communion because of whatever the case may be? This is a quote from Sanitation in Communion at the very end. It's like the second to last page where Dr. James Orton and Alton Bailey give their conclusion of all of this together. Here's a quote. No one can absolutely guarantee a Christian or anyone else that he will not get a disease from the communion cup. Did you hear that? No one can absolutely guarantee a Christian or anyone else that he will not get a disease. And so if anybody says that this book says you cannot get sick from the communion, they're simply just not paying attention to what they're reading. Now, to go on, it does say something else that I will clarify. There are so many factors, often unknown factors, that influence a human body. But if he does get a disease, the best evidence is that it will not be from the communion cup. He means most likely it's not from the communion cup. We agree with Dr. O. Noel Gill from the British Public Health Service that the fact that no disease has ever been shown to come from the common cup is strong evidence of its safety. If no case of illness has been traced to the communion cup in 100 years, the chance of being the first victim seems less than that of being hit by a falling meteor. Pages 43 to 44 of Sanitation in Communion. Now, I will speak to that last point. Dr. O. Noel Gill of the British Public Health Service said that no disease has ever been shown to come from the common communion cup. That is not a false statement. That is not false. It's a true statement to some degree. What it is not showing is that, of course, no church does experiment on the cup every single service and takes a swab sample after everybody's communed to then go and test it and then look at all the participants to see if anybody gets sick 3 to 4 days later, and then draw the conclusion that somebody got sick because of the germs that were on that cup. That's never done. It was done a few times in research, in mock communion services, but it's never been done in live service, and definitely not on a continual weekly or however often basis that people take communion. And so, again, it's not a false statement that somebody getting sick from communion has never been documented. That's true. but you would have to experiment every week to make sure that that is in fact a valid argument. What I will say about all that is the risk, and what they agree with, is that the risk is very, very low. It's lower, the risk of getting sick from communion. It's lower than you going out and drinking with your friends on the weekend, sharing the same bottle. It's lower than you reaching down to pull up your chair and grabbing that nasty edge of the seat and then going and reaching for your fries. It's lower than going and shaking somebody's hand. It's lower than doing a lot of things that you might do in human interaction, including going to the grocery store. And so if you're going to do any of these things, and then you're going to look at the communion cup and you're going to say, that is gross, I'm not doing that. That is a high risk. We have to abandon the communion service for until there is a vaccination for coronavirus or until Christ comes again. We ain't doing that, man. That's not being consistent. That's not being consistent at all. In fact, it doesn't align with evidence that we have from several different research studies throughout the years. And so I would ask you to be consistent. And now let's talk about this from a scriptural perspective and a logical perspective. Jesus said on more than one occasion, John 14 and 15 being one of them, if you love me, keep my commandments. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 3, 4, and 5, he goes on to talk about he who says he knows me but does not keep my commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. And so a lot of people say, well, God knows what's in my heart. But if your heart is what you say it is, then you don't have to look inside of your being to see what you are like, because Jesus said in Mark 8 that from the heart proceeds objective signs of what your heart's like: fornications, lyings, hypocrisy, and so forth. All that to say, the important thing here in all this debate is, whether it's sanitary or not, the importance is keeping the commandments of God. And sometimes God asks us to do things that we scratch our heads and we think, what, God? Like Abraham, go kill your firstborn and only son, which is the son that I'm supposed to bring the promise of blessing through. And Abraham's like, he could very well could have said, Lord, this isn't safe. Kill my son. But he goes ahead and he does exactly what Jesus said. God says. Now God stops him before he does it. But there's many things where the people of Israel are surrounded by a 1,000,000-man army in the days of Hezekiah. And they're like, you're telling us to trust in you and you'll deliver us from the situation. It doesn't seem to match up with reality and logic, but they go ahead and trust in God and he delivers them from incalculable odds. And so when God asks us to do something and it doesn't make sense, we might make assumptions that this is not safe. We might have no evidence for why we're not going to obey his command, but nonetheless, it seems logical to us to do what we're going to do and not observe this commandment. We are not trusting in God. And at the end of the day, this life is not about this life. This life is not about how safe we can be ultimately. I'm not saying don't be safe. I'm just saying that's not what life's about. If following God leads us to mockings, leads us to scourgings, leads us to chains, imprisonments, being sawn in two, I'm referring to all the different persecutions that men of faith in God endured, according to Hebrews 11 and verses 40s in there. These people went through many persecutions in physical, unsafe circumstances because they trusted in God and they kept his commandments. We're simply being asked to observe a communion supper, which we talked about. The risk of getting sick from it is very, very low in reality, and not what public opinion would make it out to be. But nonetheless, if there even is a chance of getting sick, which I'm not saying there is not any chance at all, but even if you do get sick from it, would it be better to keep the commandments of God? Again, ask yourself, would it be better to be sawn in two, dying with faith in God? I think it would be, according to the testament of Scripture. If you don't have much respect for the authority of Scripture or it being the Word of God, then you're not going to agree with me. I understand that. But if you are anybody that does, please be consistent with me here. Another thing I like to think about is in the days of Jesus, Jesus created everything. He was God in the beginning. And they said, let us create man in our image. And he created everything. And he certainly knows if he can create the atom, which it took us hundreds of years to figure out the structure of, and we still don't know everything about it. He created that. You don't think he knows about germs? And when he implemented the Lord's Supper with 1 cup and 1 loaf, don't you think he understood the health risk or lack thereof that was involved? Another thing, think about this. Jesus lived in a time where there were no vaccinations, and public health care is not even a 30-second cousin to what we have today. So ultimately, it was a lot more unsafe, germ-wise, to do what he did. I mean, we're talking about no vaccines for mumps, measles, typhoid fever, diphtheria. What else? Well, chickenpox isn't super dangerous, I don't guess, but chickenpox either. Hepatitis. There was no vaccine for coronavirus, even though there wasn't coronavirus, flu, whatever. Go down the line. And so he, knowing that there is leprosy abounding everywhere and all these other diseases, goes ahead and implements the service with 1 cup and 1 loaf. Why would Jesus do that? Perhaps the God of creation knew that it would be okay. Another thing that I would like you to consider is that he traveled with disciples who on one occasion in Mark chapter 7, and I'm reading from verse 5 here, the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" It was the tradition of the elders of the Pharisees and scribes that they wash their hands when they go to eat. Now, do you ever see people come out of the bathroom and they haven't washed their hands? And yet you shake their hands? Or you're talking very closely with those people and might hug those people? You're not worried about getting germs from them, but you are worried about getting germs from a communion service. Be consistent. And then finally, when Jesus, he reaches out his hand and he heals a man with leprosy on more than one occasion, and he touches them on the skin. Now, let's not forget that Hebrews chapter 2 and chapter 5 remind us that Jesus was a God-man, meaning that he endured all the same temptations and sufferings that we do. And when he did things like reaching out and touching this leprosy, yes, he had the power to do it. And yes, he had the power to heal that leprosy and all that, but he still had to trust that the God that sent him to earth, his Father, would indeed keep him from contracting that leprosy. It still took an element of faith because he was a God-man enduring all the same trials and temptations that we do. Do you think about that? And so he trusted in his Father to protect him. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not promising that God is going to protect us when we take of that communion cup. I can't personally say that because God never promised to keep his people physically safe for observing his commandments. Again, refer to Hebrews 11:35 to 38. Also, think about many different people that are kind of like the Jobs of the world. In the last year, several good men and women that I know, you look at them and you think, why in the world did they die? And why did they die in such a tragic way? Did they do something wrong? Like, what's the deal? And the deal is, when you look at the story of Job, that all these things that happened to him, he's like, man, I've been kind to the poor. I've looked out for widows and orphans. I've done all these things and judged justly at the gates of the city and all these things. Why is this happening to me? He starts to question God. And the fact is that God never promised physical safety for obeying his commandments. And if you're saying that God will protect you from getting sick from observing the communion, then you have to ask yourself, then why did God not protect these people who died, but yet they seemed to be good people? And so I don't believe, because God's never promised to protect us from any germs during the communion. He has implemented a service that is, again, very low risk of getting sick, but at the end of the day, is it a possibility that you could get sick? It's a possibility. It's a possibility you could get sick by doing a lot of things that you do, and yet you still do them. And so again, the point is consistency, and at the end of the day, trusting in God no matter what happens. And like Job said, though you slay me, still will I trust in him. Let's have that attitude. I hope that this review encourages you to pick up a copy of Sanitation in Communion today. Again, the ebook, request through the website, or download from tncgchurchofchrist.org. We'll see you next time here on 5 Minute Bible Study.